Hi and welcome. I will give you a short intro about the program. You are watching Jewish culture in Sweden online. My name is Hans Gefors. I'm a Swedish composer. I write mostly opera and vocal music. I used to be a professor of composition in Malmö. And this is an interview with American composer Steve Reich, one of the most influential composers of our time, whose music is being played and listened to all over the world since the beginning of the 70s. Influential because Steve Reich was one of the composers that changed the agenda of new music by introducing a new way of using rhythm, tonality, and mesmerizing sonorities. We are happy to have you with us, Steve.
Happy to be here.
Uh, it is the difficult times of Corona, and here in Sweden we now ask each other, how are you, with a new urgency. So, how are you, you and your family?
Well, thank God we're all right now, but we're in self-imposed quarantine. So basically, we order our groceries online, so we don't have to go shopping. I take a walk outside and I wear a mask, but there's very few people around, so it's really quite easy. And we're not going back to the New York area until it's safe to travel, and it's hard to say when that will be. Certainly not before the end of May or June at the earliest.
What I would like to talk to you about here is a musical form, a large scale movements, long pieces. Most of your pieces are long and uses a tonal language with harmonies built on thirds and fifths. What I wonder is, do you plan the form of your pieces before you start, or do you have a sort of initial idea which you search your way through the piece? How do you do it?
Well, it really varies from piece to piece. If a piece has a text, a written text, then that text must be the first thing that I devise. That would apply to pieces like the desert music or Daniel variations, or the piece that I'm working on right now, which is called Traveler's Prayer, from which the text comes from the Siddur, the traditional Jewish prayer book. I'm not using the
Once more,
text of the actual prayer itself, the body of the text, but rather several texts which are customarily added to it. Uh, so those texts come first. And then the question in this particular piece has been how to have three separate texts, kind of as three separate movements, but that are all joined together and that hang together. And rather unusually for me, and perhaps hearkening back to when I was much younger, I'm trying to keep it all pretty much tonally in the same area, pretty much all in a signature of one flat, whether it's D minor, F major, or whatever. And uh, that is in contrast, to answer your question, to my general pre-compositional activities, which is to map out roughly the harmonic layout of the piece as much as I can. And in the last 20, 30 years, I have come upon a certain patterning of key change, which you alluded to, which is to go up by minor thirds. So if your first section was in C, then your next section would be an E flat, and then up to F sharp, and then up to A, and then back to C. So you would have a cycle that would come back to where it began. It has nothing to do with the diminished seventh chord. It's not that. It's a way of moving from one key to the other, which I find very easy to do and allows me to have many common tones and all kinds of familiar things that we're used to. But finally, most important answer to your question is that no matter what the pre-compositional thoughts are, you're always starting off with tabula rasa. You don't know what's going to go on. And the most difficult thing in the world for me is starting. And once I get that going, then I begin to feel, aha, okay, I'm on terra firma. I've got some idea where I am. But you must always, I measure 15 is done. Now measure 16 is in certain respects mysterious.
Yes. Um, uh, it is the tabula rasa. I know that from my own experience. You have nothing, and then you suddenly there is something, and then you go on from there. But what I think about your music is when I plan this our conversation, that you often call your instrumental music, you all often call them music simply. You have several pieces called music, and you use in your instrumental pieces no imagery, no narration, no narrative content. It is what we call absolute music. When you write this kind of pieces without texts, does it put higher demands on formal clarity, on the structural discipline from your side?
Absolutely. In every piece I've ever done, there has to be exactly what you're talking about. What I meant before was that clarity is achieved en route, not by a predetermined roadmap, but intuitively using one's ears and one's musical good sense to achieve such unity of form. Absolutely, you must have that, but how you find it is not predetermined.
No. And I have been listening to your pieces from the last 5 years, Runner and Pulse, which I found, and I remember that you, in a very important article in already 1967, you wrote, it was the article Music as a Gradual Process, and you said, I quote you here, I want to be able to hear the process happening throughout the music. Said in those times, it was quite a it was not like what all the rest of the composers said, so to speak. But now I listen to your latest works. I find it's not gradual processes at all. I hear contrasts, surprising twists and turns, phrasings, modulations, melodies in the foreground, patterns in the background, bass lines, counterpoint, so on. What has changed during, it's 50 years now, more than 50 years ago. Many things have changed, but how do you...
Wouldn't it be terrible if I was still writing the same pieces? You would have forgotten about me, and rightfully so.
All the music from when you had this phase, what is called, phase
changing, or phase shifting.
Yes, in drumming, the phase shifting in drumming, for example, which I myself heard in the 70s.
Yeah, well, drumming was perhaps the climax and the end of the phasing process for me. After drumming, I felt, this is wonderful, basta. Now there are other ways to proceed. I think, in terms of, you mentioned this essay, which is called Music as a Gradual Process. It's a wonderful essay, and like all really good musical theory, it describes music which was written prior to the theory. Bad musical essays are become manifestos for what to do in the future, and I run from that like the plague. In other words, I was describing in 1968 what I had done previous to 1968, not a recipe for what to do afterwards. So by clarifying those thoughts, now they are. I have a turn or desire for clarity and good structural thinking, but how that is manifest is constantly changing and growing. And if it wasn't, people would have lost interest in what I was doing a long time ago, and I wouldn't blame them.
Yes, and now when I hear your music, which was not present at the time, I must say though that this article of yours was very important when it came.
Yes.
It was, I myself used it when in contact with my colleagues and so on, because it was a sort of new thing that you should actually be able to hear, to follow by your ears what you were
Right.
doing. And
Well,
I think that
I, as you and many other people, as growing up in the 1950s and 60s, we were hearing the music of Boulez and Stockhausen and Berio. Luciano Berio, one of my very finest teachers, by the way. And in much of that music, particularly Boulez and Stockhausen, one knew that there was an incredible systematic organization, but that systematic organization could not possibly be heard unless you were Pierre Boulez, who I believe you might actually have heard all of that, because he was quite remarkable and amazing musician, and I salute him. But for the rest of the human race, this was basically we had no idea what was going on with all the complex organization while listening to the results. Similar with John Cage. I mean, you throw yarrow stalks or you throw coins, and the result of that is who knows what the relationship is between the process of throwing the coins and the musical notes that result. By listening, one would never determine that. And that was the aesthetic of the day. I found that very difficult to relate to, both in terms of just relating to the music itself and that way of thinking. So I guess I did something which made sense to me, which I think was very similar to most of the music which preceded Schoenberg, and certainly applied to Stravinsky and Bartok and many composers who were not following 12-tone and serial recipes. There were all of these composers I'm talking about are great composers and great musicians. Don't misunderstand me. As I say, I studied with Luciano Berio and learned a great deal. But you have to do ultimately what you are intuitively drawn to, because without that energy in yourself, if I don't love it, certainly you won't either.
Um, now I would like to hear a comment also on functional tonality. If you look back on the history of Western music, which has been very much into making long pieces with movements, keeping the attention of the listener for very long times. What is your relation to functional tonality? And for the listeners, I could say, going from the dominant to the tonic chord, the cadence that comes up around the year 1600 here in Europe, and then was developed up to our day, actually. And composers of today don't use this functional tonality, but even so, when I hear progressions in your music, sometimes I hear, deceptive cadences like in Wagner. I think you are going somewhere, but not. You are, take another turn and go some other place. So that's why I wanted to listen to what you think of functional tonality and the cadences.
Well, certainly what you're talking about, which we hear in full flower and glory in Johann Sebastian Bach, perhaps more complex than those who followed him, at least more so, let's say, than Haydn and Mozart, is something that I was brought up with, as we were all brought up with as children, and it becomes part of our intuitive thinking. On the other hand, I became seriously interested in music, really as a consuming passion at the age of 14, when I heard The Rite of Spring and the Fifth Brandenburg and bebop. Now, the harmonies in Bach are one thing. The harmonies in The Rite of Spring, and there are harmonies there, is quite another thing. And I think if we look at it historically, we see what? At the beginning of the classical period, Haydn, Mozart, and so on, we have a very clear basically tonic dominant relationship, which as we pass through Beethoven and onwards becomes increasingly chromatic, i.e. we introduce more and more non-scale tones. Simultaneously with that increasing chromaticism, and so we go from Schubert, Schumann, Brahms, Wagner, Mahler, we have a loosening of the rhythmic regularity. So any orchestra can play a Mozart symphony or a Haydn symphony without a conductor. No orchestra can play a Mahler symphony without a conductor. It's not really a beat, it's a gesture. Now, I personally have no emotional rapport with late romantic music. I admire it, I see the genius of it, but I have no desire to listen to it. Because I crave that regularity, rhythmic regularity, which is also associated with a more limited harmonic palette. Now, we have other important historical influences that step in there. Debussy is basically saying what Bill Clinton said about something else: mend it, don't end it. In other words, he introduced new scales, which he partly heard from Indonesia, and new scales which enabled you to say, well, I kind of, and of course Debussy does finally have 5/1 cadences here and there to close something off, but he opens up a world of harmonic ambiguity, which was essential for enabling us to continue with familiar harmonies, but to extend them without eliminating them and saying, well, forget about harmony. We must have a tone roll. We have a new way of working. No. We understand the history. Now we see that the history can be developed, loosened, and extended. And to this we have an eternal debt to Claude Debussy and to Ravel and through that whole period of time, of which Stravinsky is really a large part as well. Okay, so I'm listening to not just the Rite of Spring, but the Petrushka and the Firebird, and then later on, believe it or not, talk about functional harmony. I love the Reich Progress. It's the only opera I do love. So I grew up at a time, now bebop has got functional harmony, but you're dealing primarily with altered seventh chords and rarely any triads. So I was faced with a world of the present, i.e. 20th century developments of harmonies which go back to the 16th century, as you mentioned. So not only that, I became interested, as many composers in my generation, like Arvo Pärt, for example, going back way before the 16th century, going back to Periton and Leonine in Paris in the 12th century, where functional harmony doesn't exist, but key centers or tonal centers exist. If you have a melody, da, 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 and then you go, da, for what, 4 minutes, you have the equivalent of a harmonic center. Da, da, oh, we have a modulation. We have a new melodic tone extended so long that it's not a drone, but it's temporarily the new harmonic center of the piece. So these are drastically different ways of achieving tonal coherence. I would say I am devoted to tonal coherence, and there are lots of ways to do that, especially growing up as I grew up and as you grew up, with all these possibilities that we garnered from the 12th century to the 21st.
Yes, well, tonal coherence. That's yes, that's a good word to take with you from here. And I was thinking, and when you were saying this, also, I mean, you have been a musician most of your life.
Yes.
It was called. You had an ensemble, Steve Reich and ensemble, and musicians, Steve Reich and musician.
Yes, that's
Isn't
correct.
that right?
Yeah.
Yes. That must also have meant something for your composition.
Absolutely.
Not only that you wrote for these musicians, but also your musicianship, so to
Yes.
speak.
When I remember when I was a student of Luciano Berio, I was at Mills College in Oakland, California. And of course, during the days, I went to the classes. And I remember many students, I'd have forgotten their names, would bring in these incredibly black score filled with notation, which I got they never played them at the piano. and I was seriously doubtful as to whether they heard them in their heads. And we had a phrase for that. I'm sure in Europe you have the same phrase, paper music, Papiermusik. And at night, I would go to hear John Coltrane at the Jazz Workshop in San Francisco. He picked up his soprano saxophone or his tenor sax. I must have heard him 50 times at least. And the music came out, brilliant, genius music, which, by the way, would very often, I'm talking now 62, 60, 61, 62, 63, 64, be music on one harmony or two harmonies for half an hour. So there was a certain harmonic stasis in the air in those days. But in terms of the, when I see Coltrane and I would see these composers with their paper music, it was kind of like a musical moral question, which is the proper model? Well, clearly the Coltrane model was the honest model. So I sort of felt to myself, well, I may not be a virtuoso, I certainly am not, but whatever, I want to be part of the performance of my own music. I want to be part of the making of it. No orchestra is breaking down their door to hear what I'm doing. I'm not really interested in writing for the orchestra. But no other groups are, so I better do it myself with my musical friends and associates. And I began doing that seriously in 1966. And for 40 years until 2006, Steve Reich Musicians was performing and touring around the world. And that had an enormous effect on my music. And most simply, and I'm sure you would completely appreciate this, it made me have the practical considerations of performance uppermost in my mind at all times. Now, we have a great history of that. People say, well, why are there all these different versions of Handel's Messiah? Well, that's because Handel was organizing the concerts. And this year, well, so-and-so is not in town. Okay, well, listen, I'll change it, so take his part. We can all completely relate to that. It's a wonderful human practical response to getting your music performed and making whatever additions or changes you have to do. I had to face that. Some of my best performers, Russ Hartenberger, Bob Becker, were very busy doing other things. So I better get somebody else. Well, they have to play different parts in the piece. Or I had to deal with the practicalities of music making, and that's pure gold. It's the reality, and also it gives you a certain attitude so that other musicians sense that when you are speaking to them, you're speaking as a friend and as a contemporary, and as if someone has the same experience and appreciates any difficulties. And if you write something that's hard to play, you deserve to have it badly played.
I suppose also it meant you had a direct contact with your audience, with the listeners. You know, we were talking about the attention span of the listeners.
Right.
I suppose you also, from that respect,
definitely. Well, I remember, very practically speaking, in rehearsals with my own ensemble early on, particularly I think music for mallet instruments, voices, and organ, which was 1973. And we were rehearsing it, and I noticed in the third section, as I watched occasionally, I'm playing, but I could see out of the corner of my other musicians, and they all looked very bored. Now, this is real musical criticism, and you better take it seriously. These are musicians who liked what I did. They were very sympathetic to me personally, and if they're bored, it's probably my fault. So I threw that section out. And I rewrote it, and they weren't bored anymore, and neither was the audience. So you're absolutely right, yes.
That's great. I really feel that you have been very productive and inspired the last few years, and I understand you're still working on, you're doing new stuff now.
Yes, I am.
Is that so?
Yes, I am. Well, someone asked me once, do you plan on retiring? And I said, no, I plan on dying. Hopefully near a keyboard and my laptop.
Okay, then you know I have seen a colleague of mine sent me a picture. It was two pictures actually. The first picture you could see a composer, and it was this was a composer at his computer, and then this other picture it said composer in quarantine. It was exactly the same picture.
Yes,
you know we are used to quarantine, so to
exactly.
speak.
I feel like I've been in quarantine indefinitely. I have to sort of remind myself, oh, there's a pandemic out there.
Yes, the same here. And I've heard you made a film to the great to pictures by the great German painter Gerhard Richter.
Yes.
Is that right?
Well, he made the film with his partner. I'm trying to remember her name, Karina Beltz. She did a lot of the hands-on work, but it was Gerhard Richter's ideas, and it came out of his book called Patterns that he did in 2012. Yes, I spent about a year or more working on I never wrote music for a film, and I don't plan to write music for any other films in the future. But Richter had invited me to play some of my pieces, drumming part one and music for 18, in one of his exhibitions in Cologne in 2009. So we met, and I was performing with the Ensemble Moderne, sitting in with them. And we didn't become friends because we lived thousands of miles apart, but we spoke and we sort of appreciated each other. Cut to 2016, and he told me, "Look, I'm going to be in New York at my gallery. Names are not my forte at age 83. At his gallery in New York and Marion Goodman Gallery. And when I meet him there, he had a new project he wanted to show me. So he showed me this book called Patterns, and he said he was going to make a film, and would I be interested in the music, and explain the structure of it, which was a very interesting structure. Basically, he was taking an abstract painting, putting it into a computer, and making mirror images of that painting, so that you would divide it in two, and then each half you would take a half of that and turn it into a mirror image. So you would have sort of the original image becoming sort of slightly. It would have, once you have symmetry like that, we have two eyes, and it begins to look like an animal or a creature. Then he would divide it in 8 and 4 and 8, 16, 30, all the way up to 4006. Now, what happened is that you would go from an abstract painting to sort of psychedelic creatures, and then gradually to straight bands of color. Now, if you look at the history of painting, he was going from, let's say, de Kooning to Frank Stella, from abstract expressionism to minimal art. But he was doing it very systematically, which is very unusual because Richter is not a systematic artist. He's famous for doing all kinds of different things. Nevertheless, he was a great admirer of music for 18 musicians, and he wanted to ask me, would I have considered writing the music for this? And I joked with him. I said, look, Gerhard, I've spent 50 years trying to be less systematic. You want to put me back in the box. But it was a challenge. Now,
is it possible to see this film? Where
it's been showing all over the world. Let's see, but of course now, because the project is in quarantine, like everything else. It was in London. First of all, it was in New York for 200 performances at a place called The Shed, which just opened up in Manhattan last year. And it was played in an art gallery world. You come in the afternoons and early evenings to see the paintings. So Richter's film was being shown with my music with live musicians at 3 or 4 times a day for 3.5 months, which was an insane kind of gig, But it worked out beautifully. Then it went to London and was played at the, I guess it was at the Barbican, and then it went to the Paris Philharmonie. It's supposed to go to Oslo, but I think that may very well be quarantined. And it is then. I think it was in Luxembourg, and
Is it always with live musicians, or?
Yes, right now, the music is not recorded. We didn't want to have it recorded. We wanted to keep it as a live performance, and we've absolutely kept the music out of any form of digital form, because once it's digital, it's all over YouTube tomorrow morning.
Absolutely.
So, but now, given the present situation, I've actually I didn't hear 200 performances, but I was at 7 or 8 of them. And towards the latter part of this 2-month run in New York, I began to just shut my eyes and listen to the music and see, is this thing working as a musical score? And I believe it does. So we're now considering, None Such Records and myself and maybe some people at the Shed are considering how to perhaps release a musical recording of the piece independent of the film. And perhaps at some times in the future, the film will go out in a recorded form. But right now, it is really, we want the music to be played live with the film and to have people see and hear the musicians. It makes a big difference.
I can imagine. Well, we can always talk to Jewish culture in Sweden.
Yeah, all you do is contact Boozy and Hawks for the music, and you can contact the Shed or Gerhard Richter's representatives to get the film, and off you go.
That sounds great. It was a wonderful talking to you, Steve, and I hope your quarantine will go on so you can write some more pieces for us.
I'm forever yours in quarantine.
That's for sure. So we say thank you to you, and let's hope we meet again.
I certainly hope so. Thank you to you too. Pleasure.
Bye, Steve.
Bye now.
Thank you for watching Jewish Culture in Sweden online. For more information on this series, please look up the website. My name is Hans Gefors, and I wish you all the best in these times. And please also look up Steve Reich's music on concerts, on records, on Spotify, and on YouTube. And he has some magnificent pieces, the latest Runner or Pulse, for example. And now I bid you farewell. Bye-bye.